He studied crime. He studied you. In the early hours of November 13th, 2022, 4 college students were found brutally stabbed to death in their shared off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. The town had never seen anything like it. No forced entry, no signs of sexual assault, no known motive, just pure silence and unimaginable violence. The suspect? Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student in criminology. A man who didn't just consume knowledge about criminal behavior, he dissected it, lived it, obsessed over it, and eventually became it. This case didn't just horrify the public because of the brutality. It disturbed something deeper. The idea that someone so trained in understanding crime could weaponize that knowledge. That understanding how violence happens might make it easier to commit. What happens when the person learning about evil is the one slowly absorbing it? What happens when academic distance becomes personal involvement? Kohberger had spent years studying criminal minds, but behind his quiet demeanor and structured intellect, something darker was brewing. A mind not just fascinated by violence, but increasingly comfortable with its logic. Cold, methodical, almost theoretical. He wasn't just watching the abyss, he was measuring it. And then he stepped in. This is not a story about another killer, it's about a mirror we don't want to look into. Because what Bryan Kohberger represents is not just the horror of what he did, but the terror of how calculated, clean, and detached it all seemed. And in that detachment, we are forced to ask, how close is the line between observer and participant? How far would someone go if they thought no one would ever see them coming? If you value deep psychological exploration over easy answers, a like will help us continue unveiling the unseen layers of the human mind. And if you haven't already, check if you're subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. This channel exists to question, not to glorify. Let's dive deeper. In the weeks before the murders, Bryan Kohberger wasn't just living, he was observing. Surveillance footage and cell tower pings later revealed something chilling. Kohberger had driven multiple times to the neighborhood where the victims lived. He wasn't a friend. He wasn't even a known acquaintance. He was, by all appearances, an outsider. Yet he returned, again and again, always silent, always unnoticed. On November 12th, 2022, the night before the murders, the 4 students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were enjoying a typical college weekend. Social media showed them smiling, out with friends. By 2 a.m., they were back home. By 4 a.m., they were all dead. The attack was brutal, but strangely controlled. One roommate slept through the entire ordeal. Another saw a masked figure, tall and silent, walking past her door. She froze and survived. Kohberger left behind no clear motive, no known grudge, no confession, but DNA was recovered from a knife sheath left on one of the beds, and it matched his. Surveillance video showed a white Hyundai Elantra speeding away from the crime scene in the early hours. Police traced the car. They traced his phone. The digital trail was cold, but complete. Even after the murders, Kohberger returned to teaching at Washington State University, just 10 miles away. He graded papers, attended class, drove past the victim's home again, as if testing the silence. His arrest came 6 weeks later in Pennsylvania, calm, collected, as if he had prepared for it too. But the timeline reveals more than logistics. It shows us a psychological pattern, one of detachment, repetition, and an eerie lack of emotional disruption. He didn't panic. He didn't disappear. He studied the scene and walked back into normal life. This wasn't the chaos of impulse. It was the choreography of control. From the beginning, Bryan Kohberger didn't fit the typical image of a killer, and perhaps that's what makes his case more disturbing. A PhD student in criminology, he had studied the very behaviors he would later be accused of performing. But what makes someone cross that line, from observation to action? Former classmates described him as intense, socially awkward, and always watching. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it didn't quite reach his eyes. He had a deep fascination with the criminal mind, but not just as an academic. He wanted to know how it felt to commit a crime and get away with it. There's a psychological term for this cold and detached style of cognition: high-functioning antisocial traits. It doesn't mean overt aggression. It means the ability to move through society unnoticed while lacking emotional empathy. People with these traits often excel in analytical fields. They observe, catalogue, mimic, but they don't connect. Kohberger's obsession with control wasn't just intellectual. Reports from those who knew him say he was rigid in his routines, critical of others, and deeply sensitive to rejection. Repeated weight loss, strict veganism, and a nearly compulsive academic drive painted the picture of a man trying to master his world, not live in it. His quietness wasn't peace, it was calculation. His social awkwardness wasn't harmless. It masked a simmering need for recognition, power, and perhaps revenge. And then there's the chilling detail. Kohberger once posted in an online forum about his experience with visual snow and depersonalization, feelings of detachment from his body and reality. He wrote that he felt like a ghost walking through life. This is not a diagnosis, but it adds a layer of introspection. A young man who may have felt invisible, irrelevant, emotionally numb, and who might have seen violence as the ultimate assertion of presence. When you combine isolation, intellectual arrogance, emotional detachment, and a craving for control, what do you get? Not always a killer, but often someone who stops seeing people as real. Bryan Kohberger wasn't just a student of criminology. He was immersed in it, living, breathing, analyzing criminal behavior, not as an outsider, but as someone quietly drawn into its psychological machinery. His academic path was precise: psychology, criminal justice, and finally a PhD with a focus on the minds of those who kill. But here's the most unsettling layer. Kohberger used what he learned not to prevent violence, but allegedly to perfect it. He knew how investigations unfolded. He knew about forensic countermeasures, behavioral red flags, and how suspects are psychologically profiled. He didn't just study the chessboard. He learned how to manipulate the pieces from both sides. This is where criminology becomes dangerous in the wrong hands. When the goal is not understanding for prevention, but domination through knowledge, the line between academic and predator begins to blur. Some believe he chose the victims to simulate a perfect case study, a psychological experiment played out in real lives. Police say he meticulously avoided leaving DNA at the scene. He allegedly turned off his phone during the time of the murders. He studied digital footprints and behavioral leakage. This wasn't impulsive, it was clinical, strategic, a mind performing an operation. One former professor said Kohberger had an eerie interest in the emotions of killers. Another claimed he was obsessed with how murderers justify their actions. These aren't casual curiosities. They are indicators of someone trying to mirror a mindset from within. And it didn't stop at theory. Months before the crime, Kohberger posted a research project in Reddit forums asking ex-cons about how they felt before, during, and after committing crimes. He wasn't just learning about them. He was collecting emotional blueprints. This isn't simply a story of a man who read too much about serial killers. It's a case study in how the thirst for understanding, when driven by ego, emptiness, or disconnection, can become the very justification for horror. Sometimes the scariest minds are not those in the shadows, but those who study the shadows too closely. One of the most unsettling theories surrounding Bryan Kohberger's psychological profile is the potential link to the incel mindset. A community marked by involuntary celibacy, deep resentment toward women, and a toxic sense of entitlement masked as victimhood. While it's important to avoid oversimplification or stereotyping, Kohberger's personal history raises questions. Accounts from his past describe a young man who struggled socially, who felt invisible or rejected by women, and who may have internalized these wounds into something more sinister over time. In some circles, he was seen as awkward, in others as strangely intense. Incel ideology isn't just about lack of romantic success. At its core, it's about perceived injustice, a belief that the world owes affection, attention, and intimacy, and that others who receive these things are somehow less deserving. It feeds on alienation, shame, and eventually rage. Some have speculated that the choice of victims, young, outgoing college students, was not random. It could represent an unconscious punishment for those who embodied everything the perpetrator felt denied: connection, normalcy, inclusion. The crime then becomes not just violence, but symbolic vengeance. Add to that the traits often associated with narcissistic personality patterns: a deep need for control, hypersensitivity to rejection, and the desire to assert superiority through intellect or domination. Kohberger's meticulous behavior, his cold detachment, and the chilling precision of the crime point towards someone who needed to reclaim power, not only over others, but over his own fractured identity. This is where fantasy plays a dangerous role. If someone feels invisible for long enough, they may begin to believe that the only way to be seen is to instill fear, that the only way to matter is through destruction. When identity is built around rejection and intelligence becomes the fuel for revenge, the result can be a distorted form of self-affirmation, one that seeks validation not through connection, but through cruelty. The question that lingers is not just, why did he do it? But rather, how many others walk the edge of that same emotional abyss? Perhaps one of the most chilling aspects of Bryan Kohberger's case lies not in what he did, but in how he behaved afterward. The absence of visible remorse, the calculated attempts to resume normal life, the careful silence maintained through arrest and trial, all of it paints a portrait of someone either terrifyingly detached or dangerously strategic. Is this emotional coldness a symptom of something deeper? Psychopathy is often characterized by a lack of empathy, shallow affect, and an inability to feel guilt. Could Kohberger fall somewhere along that spectrum? Or are we witnessing something even more disturbing, a conscious decision to suppress emotion in favor of control? Some experts argue that true remorse is hard to fake and even harder to hide. Its absence may suggest a profound disconnection from one's actions, or a belief that the crime was somehow justified, rationalized, or necessary. In either case, it reveals a psyche that does not respond to violence with inner collapse, but with eerie calm. Alternatively, others propose a more calculating view: the silence, the stoicism, the absence of visible guilt. It may all be part of a strategy, perhaps to avoid further incrimination, perhaps to maintain psychological power. In the courtroom of public opinion, appearing unfazed becomes its own unsettling message. You cannot read me, you cannot affect me. But what does it mean to not feel remorse after taking 4 lives? Is it pathology? Is it defense? Or is it the final act in a plan built on intellectual pride and emotional detachment? In the mind of someone like Kohberger, remorse might not be a moral compass, but a liability. If his identity is rooted in superiority, then admitting guilt would dismantle the structure that held his ego together. That silence might not be emptiness, but resistance. And this is where psychology confronts its limits, because no matter how many labels we apply or how many theories we construct, we are left with a haunting truth. There are minds that feel nothing, not because they cannot, but because they choose not to. As the world awaits clarity, a date has finally been set: July 23rd, 2025. That's when Bryan Kohberger will face sentencing. After months of pre-trial procedures, speculation, and psychological dissection, the judicial system prepares to pronounce what may be 4 consecutive life sentences, one for each life taken in the quiet town of Moscow, Idaho. This moment, however, is more than legal formality. It's the final act of a story that began not with blood, but with theory. A man who studied the criminal mind, who asked classmates how they would escape a murder. A man who seemed to seek answers, and then perhaps tried to act them out. And now, as we approach the sentencing, the question lingers like a shadow. Was this all just an experiment? Was this man so detached from moral frameworks that he viewed human life through the cold lens of academic inquiry? The families of the victims await this verdict not for justice alone, but for closure, for the faint hope that this final step might offer some explanation, some sliver of understanding into why. But Bryan Kohberger has remained largely silent. No apology, no breakdown, no sign of remorse. That silence, clinical, calculated, is itself a window into something deeply unnerving. It's not just what he did, it's how little of it seems to echo within him. If you value deep psychological exploration over easy answers, leave a like. It helps this channel stay committed to reflection, not spectacle. What struck you the most about the psychology behind this case? Your reflections are essential to keeping this exploration alive, and if you're not yet subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked, take a moment to verify. We don't chase crime, we dissect the mind behind it. Because the closer we look at Bryan Kohberger, the more we confront a disturbing paradox: knowledge without empathy, intelligence without conscience, and the question that haunts long after the sentence is read: what is the human mind truly capable of when theory detaches from morality? In our next episode, we'll cover the outcome of the sentencing and what it reveals about justice, accountability, and the dark spaces between intellect and intention. See you in the next episode.